Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host, Mitch. Glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Commander's Quarters decks are built within a $25 budget. That's $25 for 100 cards. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today, though, make sure you go check out our merchandise on thecommandersquarters.com. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that you stay up to date on the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's episode is a patron-selected deck tech. Once a month, patrons of this show vote on what commander they want to see in an upcoming episode. And the commander that received the most votes for this deck tech was Lazav the Multifarious. Lazav is a 1/3 shapeshifter that costs blue-black. It has, when it enters the battlefield, Surveil 1. And pay X, Lazav the Multifarious becomes a copy of target creature card in your graveyard with converted mana cost X, except its name is Lazav the Multifarious, it's legendary in addition to its other types, and it has this ability. This is a commander with an extremely unique ability and is a very interesting card to build around. By getting the right creature cards into our graveyard, we can give Lazav some pretty sweet abilities, but we can also make it into a huge threat. Also, since it only costs 2 mana, we can get it out quickly and get going right away. So what's our strategy for this deck? Well, we want to get the right creature cards into our graveyard quickly. Again, Lazav has a very unique ability where it can become basically a copy of one of those creature cards in our graveyard. In order to do this, though, we have to pay for that card's converted mana cost. So this deck is filled with a ton of cheap creature cards that have some very sweet effects. So how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to win with either commander damage, infect, or there's one other way that we can win. Since Lazav can basically change into any creature at instant speed from our graveyard, we can do some pretty incredible things. For example, we can have him start off swinging as just a 1/1 unblockable creature, and then after he gets through the enemy's lines, we can change him into a big beater. And as for the other way that we can win, I don't want to spoil it yet, so we'll get to that later. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's go on to our first tactic. Tactic number 1, the Grindstone. First up, there's Everflowing Chalice, which is a very flexible mana rock for us. We can play it early or we can play it late, but we're going to get back half the amount of mana that we put into it. Then there's Prismatic Lens, which can tap for a colorless, or we can filter our mana with it. And next up is Star Compass, which enters the battlefield tapped. It can tap for either of our colors depending on our land situation. Then we've got a couple of mana rocks that can also draw us cards. First up, there's Mind Stone, which can tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to draw a card. Then there's Dimir Locket, which can either tap for blue or black, or we can pay 4 Dimir to tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. And next up is Hedron Archive, which can tap for 2 colorless, or we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. And then we've got some more mana rocks that each tap for 2. Worn Power Stone is going to enter the battlefield tapped, but it only costs 3. And then there's Golem's Eye and Sisay's Ring, both of which tap for 2 colorless and cost us 4 mana. Finally, we're running Heartstone, which isn't technically a mana rock. It's an artifact that costs 3, and it says, activated abilities of creatures cost 1 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the amount of mana an ability costs to activate to less than 1 mana. This is just a great way to save us some mana when it comes to activating Lazav's ability. But in order to activate Lazav's ability, we need to first get some creatures into our graveyard. So let's go through some cards that do that in tactic number 2, to the yard. First up, there's Fact or Fiction, which is going to let us reveal the top 5 cards of our library, and then an opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. We're going to put one of those piles into our hand and the other into our graveyard. And then Epiphany at the Drownyard does pretty much the exact same thing, but it's an X spell. These cards are great at helping us pick and choose which cards that we can use in our hand and which cards would be more effective in our graveyard. Next up, there's Careful Consideration, which will let us draw 4 cards and then discard 3 cards. But if we cast this spell during our main phase, instead we just have to discard 2 cards. And then Read the Runes is going to let us draw X cards, but then for each card that we draw, we have to either discard a card or sacrifice a permanent. Again, these spells are not only great at helping us draw cards, but they're also great at helping us put the right cards into our graveyard. Next up is Ancient Excavation, which will let us draw cards equal to the number of cards in our hand, and then we have to discard a card for each card drawn that way. On top of that, if we need a land early in the game, we can actually basic land cycle this too. And finally, there's Whispering Madness, which is going to make each player discard his or her hand, and then draw cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. On top of that, it has Cipher, so we can encode it onto Lazav. So then whenever Lazav hits an opponent, we can actually just cast this card again for free. This is a great way of getting a ton of cards into our graveyard and getting more and more targets for Lazav. But what are some of those targets going to be? Let's go through some of those now in tactic number 3, score some loot. First up, we're running 3 creatures that allow us to loot, which means that we're going to be able to draw a card and then discard a card. There's Enclave Cryptologist, which only costs 1, but we have to actually level it up first in order to actually get that ability. Whereas Merfolk Looter and Thought Courier already have that ability, but they cost us 2 to cast. And next up is Magus of the Bazaar, which we can tap to draw 2 cards and then discard 3 cards. Now while this is technically card disadvantage, it still works great in this deck. Because again, we just want to dig deeper and deeper to put more and more great creature cards into our graveyard. And next up we're running some evasive creatures that can help us get some cards into the graveyard through combat. First up is Night Veil Sprite, which has flying, and whenever it attacks, we're going to surveil 1. Then there's Looter Ilkor, which has shadow, and whenever it deals combat damage to opponent, we draw a card and then discard a card. And finally, there's Wharf Infiltrator, which has Skulk, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we draw a card and then discard a card. On top of that, whenever we discard a creature card, we can pay 2 to put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi creature token onto the battlefield. So these creatures not only work great in the deck on their own, but they're also great targets for Lazav. They give Lazav a form of evasion, which is huge in this deck, but they also help us get some more cards into our graveyard, which is also key. Then there's Mind Shrieker, which can actually turn Lazav into a huge threat for this deck. It's a 1/1 with flying that has 2 target player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. Mind Shrieker gets +X until the end of the turn, where X is that card's converted mana cost. So this card gives Lazav a form of evasion, it gives him the ability to mill, and it can pump him. Next up there's Forgotten Creation, which is a 3/3 with Skulk, and at the beginning of your upkeep you may discard all the cards in your hand if you do draw that many cards. This is just a great way to get more and more cards into our graveyard each turn. And finally, there's Mirror Mad Phantasm, which is a 5/1 with flying. It has pay 1 and a blue. Mirror Mad Phantasm's owner shuffles it into their library. If that player does, they reveal cards from the top of their library until a card named Mirror Mad Phantasm is revealed. The player then puts that card onto the battlefield and all other cards revealed this way into their graveyard. This card is incredible at helping us mill ourselves very, very quickly. With just this card alone, we can get some of our key pieces into our graveyard. But while we're doing this, our opponents aren't going to be sitting on their hands. So let's go through some cards that'll help us slow down our opponents in tactic number 4, Hold Up. First up there's Aetherize, which lets us return all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. This is a great way at not only protecting ourselves, but also setting our opponent back. And then there's Illusionist Gambit, which is basically going to make our opponent that's attacking us take all their creatures and turn them and attack someone else. Not only does this protect us, but it can also set 2 of our opponents back. Next up is Domineering Will, which will let us gain control of up to 3 target non-attacking creatures until the end of the turn. This is not only a great way to help us out with blocks, but it's also a great way to get rid of some creatures too. And then there's Reigns of Power, which does this in a bigger way. Reigns of Power is basically going to let us temporarily switch our creatures with someone else. So instead of having to block with our creatures, we can just take someone else's and block with those. Next up is Whelming Wave, which will return all creatures to their owner's hands except for Krakens, Leviathans, Octopuses, and Serpents. Luckily for us, most people don't run those creature types, so this is basically just going to wipe the board. Speaking of wiping the board, there's Devastation Tide, which is going to return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. On top of that, it has a miracle cost, so we can just cast it for 1 and a blue if it's the first card that we draw in a turn. Finally, there's Aether Gale, which is going to let us return 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. This is a great way for us to get rid of some pesky things on the board, and also to get Lazav through for an attack if we need to. Now these cards are great, but we still need some more cards to help protect ourselves and to protect Lazav. Let's go through those cards now in tactic number 5, the Protector. First up, we're running Unwind, which is going to let us counter target non-creature spell, and then we get to untap up to 3 lands. And then Rewind is pretty much the exact same thing, but it costs us 1 more, it can counter any spell, and we untap up to 4 lands. Both of these counter spells are great in this deck, because we always want mana available for Lazav's ability. And then we're running Orbs of Warding, which serves a double purpose in this deck. First up, it's going to give us Hexproof, so it makes it so that our opponents can't target us. This comes in huge for us because we want to keep our graveyard safe. Most spells that exile a player's graveyard require them to target that player. By giving ourselves Hexproof, we make it so that our opponents can't actually target us and do that. And the second part of this card is that if a creature would deal damage to us, prevent 1 of that damage. This is a great way to not only prevent damage to us, but to also potentially deter some attacks. So we've talked about protecting ourselves, but how can we protect Lazav further? Let's go through some cards that do that in tactic number 6, Impenetrable. First up, there's Norak Commando, which has Shroud, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Then there's Cephalid Ink Shredder, which has discard a card, Cephalid Ink Shredder gains Shroud until the end of the turn, and can't be blocked this turn. And then Slippery Scoundrel has, as long as you have the City's Blessing, it has Hexproof and can't be blocked. So when Lazav becomes a copy of one of these cards, it's going to be much harder for our opponents to deal with. Next up, we've got a couple of creatures that can give Lazav Indestructible. Darksteel Mirror just straight up is a 0/1 that has Indestructible. And then Kefnet the Mindful is a 5/5 that not only has Indestructible, but it also has Flying. And then there's Yahenni, which is a 2/2 with haste, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. And on top of that, we can sacrifice another creature to give it indestructible until the end of the turn. So not only can we protect Lazav by making him into a copy of one of these creatures, but we can also make him into a threat too. But even with all these protections, sometimes it's just not safe to have Lazav on the battlefield. So let's go through some more cards in tactic number 7, Out of Here. First up, there's Cavern Harpy, which is a 2/1 with flying and has pay 1 life, return Cavern Harpy to its owner's hand. So with Lazav on the battlefield, all we have to do is turn it into Cavern Harpy and then just pay 1 life to get it back to our hand. This is a great way for us to save Lazav in a situation that just doesn't have any other answers. And then there's Escape Artist, which is unblockable, and we can pay a blue to discard a card from our hand to return it to our hand. Then there's Skywing Aven, which has flying, and we can discard a card to return to our hand. And Thalico Scout has Shadow, and we can discard a card to return to our hand. So not only do these cards give Lazav some evasion, but they can also give him a good way to return to our hand. On top of that, by making us discard a card, we can actually get more and more creatures into our graveyard that we need. Now these cards are great at giving Lazav some evasion, but let's go through the best cards that do that in this deck. So it's time to go into tactic number 8, Infiltrate. First up, we've got some creatures that we can turn Lazav into for just 1 mana. Triton Shorestalker, Mistcloaked Herald, Gudul Lurker, and Slitherblade each just cost 1 and they can't be blocked. So at any time for 1 mana, we can make Lazav unblockable by just paying 1 if one of these cards is in our graveyard. This is a great way for us to start off our combat so we know that Lazav can get through. And then there's Dimir Infiltrator, which also can't be blocked, but it's going to cost us 2 mana. But it does have the added benefit of being able to transmute so it can put itself into our graveyard. And when we do transmute it, we can search our library for any card that has a converted mana cost of 2 and put it into our hand. There are plenty of great cards that this card can search for in this deck, but there are also other ways that we can do that. Let's talk about finding those cards and getting them into our graveyard in tactic number 9, Perfect Placements. First up, there's Carrion Feeder, which can't block, but we can sacrifice a creature with it to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Sometimes the only way that we can actually get a creature into our graveyard that we need there is to sacrifice it. So we're also going to be running Dimir Houseguard. Dimir Houseguard has Fear, and we can sacrifice a creature to regenerate it. And if we transmute it, we can discard it to search our library for any card with a converted mana cost of 4 and put that card into our hand. This is a great way to tutor up a card that can help us out, but there are even better ways to do this. There are cards like Diabolic Tutor and Razaketh's Right that let us search for any card in our deck. There are a couple of very specific cards in this deck that we'll get into that can help us finish out the game. And then there's Corpse Connoisseur, which when it enters the battlefield, we can search our library for a creature card and put that into our graveyard and then shuffle our library. On top of that, we can unearth it for 3 and a black so we can do it again. This card is fantastic because it immediately gets that creature card into our graveyard so Lazav can become them right away. And finally, another great card in this deck is Final Parting. Final Parting is going to let us search for 2 cards. One will go into our hand and the other will go into our graveyard. But what are some of those creatures that we're going to be putting into our graveyard to finish off our opponents? Let's go through them now in tactic number 10, End Boss. First up, there's Nexithid, which is a 7/7 for 3. It does have the downside, though, that when it enters the battlefield, you have to choose an opponent, and then it gets -1/-1 for each card in the chosen player's hand. But if this is in our graveyard and Lazav becomes this creature, there is no downside. So basically, at any time for 3 mana, we can turn Lazav just into a 7/7 beater. And then there's Night Howler and Mortivore, both of which pretty much do the exact same thing. When Lazav becomes them, his power and toughness are going to be each equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards. On top of that, if Lazav is Mortivore, we can just pay a black to regenerate him. With the amount of creatures that we put into the graveyard and the amount of creatures that are going to be going in our opponent's graveyard throughout the game, this can make Lazav huge. Next up is another card that can make Lazav into a giant beater with Consuming Aberration. Consuming Aberration's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyards. And then whenever you cast a spell, each opponent's going to reveal cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card and then put those cards into their graveyard. When Lazav becomes a copy of Consuming Aberration, he can easily become a one-hit kill. Then there's Vector Asp, which can turn Lazav into a one-hit kill in another way. If Lazav is a copy of Vector Asp, just by paying a black, we can give him Infect until the end of the turn. This is huge because even if we switch Lazav to another creature, he will still have Infect. So instead of needing 21 commander damage to kill someone, we just need 10 poison damage. Now while this is a great effect, it's still not the best card in the deck. The best card in our deck is the Golden Pig, which is the #1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Phage the Untouchable. Phage is a 4/4 avatar minion that costs 3 black. It has when Phage the Untouchable enters the battlefield, if you didn't cast it from your hand, you lose the game. Whenever Phage deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature, it can't be regenerated. And whenever Phage deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. So even though we are pretty much cheating on getting Phage out there by making Lazav a copy of it, we don't lose the game because it's not entering the battlefield. And if Lazav is Phage, all we have to do is hit an opponent once and they're dead. With all the evasion that we can give Lazav in this deck, it's very easy for us to do this. And it doesn't even matter what that player's life total is. If we hit them with Lazav Phage, they immediately die. There is no other card like this, and no card that can make an impact as big as this for this deck. And that's why Phage the Untouchable is the Golden Pig for the deck. This is a very fun and flexible deck, and I highly recommend that you give it a try. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. We're going to be running 36 lanes in this deck, including Aether Hub. When Aether Hub enters the battlefield, we get an energy. And then we can either tap it for a colorless, or we can tap and pay that energy to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And then we've got Submerged Boneyard, Salt Marsh, Dimir Guildgate, Jawar Isle Refuge, and Dismal Backwater, each of which enters the battlefield tapped and can tap for either a blue or a black. On top of that, Jawar Isle Refuge and Dismal Backwater will each gain us a life when they come into play. Then there's Dimir Aqueduct, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, we have to return a land back to our hand. But it does have the upside, though, being able to tap for blue-black. Next up is Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice them to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Then there's Esper and Grixis Panorama, both of which can tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice them to search our library for either an island or a swamp and put into play tapped. And finally, we're going to be running 25 basic lands in this deck, including 17 islands and 8 swamps. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Lazav the Multifarious EDH Rec deck is going to set you back $183.73, so let's see what we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in just under budget at $24.99. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within that $25 budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, there's Invisible Stalker, which comes in at $1.75. It's a 1/1 human rogue that costs 1 and a blue. And it has hexproof and it can't be blocked. Being able to give Lazav these abilities for just 2 mana is pretty unheard of. Then there's Bantu the Glorified, which comes in at $1.73. Bantu is a 4/6 god that costs 2 black. It has Menace and Indestructible, and it can't attack or block unless a creature died under your control this turn. You can also pay 1 and a black to sacrifice another creature to scry 1, and each opponent's going to lose 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is a great way to give Lazav both Menace and Indestructible for just 3 mana. Next up is Jace's Archivist, which comes in at $1.47. It's a 2/2 Vidalcan Wizard that costs 1 blue. It has pay a blue and tap it. Each player discards his or her hand and then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. This is just a great way for us to get more and more creature cards into our graveyard by activating this ability each turn. And then there's Necrotic Ooze, which comes in at $5.67. Necrotic Ooze is a 4/3 ooze that costs 2 black. It has, as long as Necrotic Ooze is on the battlefield, it has all activated abilities of all creature cards in all graveyards. So not only do we get the activated abilities of creature cards in our own graveyard, but also we can get some great abilities from our opponent's graveyards too. Next up is Buried Alive, which comes in at $2.61. Buried Alive is a sorcery that costs 2 and a black. It says, search your library for up to 3 creature cards and put them into your graveyard and then shuffle your library. Being able to search for the perfect 3 creature cards and put them into our graveyard is huge for this deck. And finally, there's Diabolic Intent, which is going to cost you $4.52. It's a sorcery that costs 1 and a black, but as an additional cost, you have to sacrifice a creature. It says, search your library for a card and put that card into your hand and then shuffle your library. This is just a very efficient tutor, and we don't mind sacrificing creatures to get them into our graveyard anyway. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you use that deck list link in the description below. Because not only will you get great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure you follow us on social media so that you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. If you enjoyed this deck tech, please like it and subscribe to the channel. And make sure you check out our other deck techs, Commander excluded episodes, and super budget episodes too. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.